paper that meant nothing. And so the thing is, those aren't going to go away. So what can we do to make the thing better? I mean, the government's going to stay involved. The industry entities are going to stay involved. And I'll pause there.
All right, you actually brought something. I'd kind of like to know. You don't have to. It's DefCon. I'd like to know what the mix of the audience is. How many people are pen testers in the audience or vulnerability assessment? Cool. How about people that are just compliance wonks, one way or another, have gotten sucked into compliance as a career?
Nobody's raising. Oh, I got a few. Look at that.
That's just as many as claim they know how to penetrate things.
Yeah. How about general purpose network or systems admin folk? We have an interesting mix, and you're all interested in PCI. I mean, I'm a packet monkey, and I've been turned into a compliance guy because of what Dave said. This stuff, you can't get away from it. You cannot get away from it. So where do we go?
Well, I mean, we can't keep screaming into the darkness, right? You can't just be pissed off that this is here. What we should be pissed off about, to Dave's point, it's the content, right? So what that checklist looks like sucks. The average skill set is going down in a lot of the QSA. Some of the QSA shops are downright corrupt. They'll fail you and then sell you the passing grade. So it's really not about getting rid of the system. It's really about, we're going to have some sort of compliance process. It's structure and content, and the content sucks. The reason we have grandma on the end there, and I didn't have to make fun of the PCI Council, they did it themselves. That's the PCI Rocks video on YouTube, and if you haven't seen it yet, you need to experience this.
Hilarity ensues.
Yes, in fact, the reason Anton isn't here is
pick up some acid in the hall while you're here this weekend and watch that, because it might make sense in that context.
One of the reasons Anton may not be here, we could speculate, is because we made him promise that if we got accepted, he would do an interpretive dance to the PCI video. But the bottom line is that grandma there is the antivirus grandma. And we have our oldest control.
Antivirus.
Antivirus, that's right. But but what we've codified is we're making sure people spend on the digital dozen, right? The dirty dozen. And if you look at that list, it's firewall. How many of you guys would be stopped by a firewall? IDS, not even IPS. I mean, the Gartner Magic Geometry leader for IPS got a 14% score after they tuned for 2 days in the NSS test labs.
But I have a compensating control for that.
Well, it's going to be compromised. But these things they're not useless, but they're really long in the tooth. And what we have is an incredibly static set of controls and best practices designed several years ago that never change, right?
Well, and it gets worse. Now we're coming up with 1.3 or 2.0 of the PCI-DSS. They're going from a 2-year life cycle to a 3-year life cycle. They're trying to make it so that everything is going to be along the same date time. We are not expecting to see major changes from 1.2 to 1.3. We're not seeing a lot of new information, so how do we use this tool? I mean, really, PCI is a compliance tool instead of just something we have to check boxes off, and that's one of the problems we have, is that we keep thinking of it as a checklist instead of a tool to make management do what we want.
I mean, if we have changes, look at all the great talks you saw at Black Hat and B-Sides and DefCon. Look at all these people dropping new research. Do you think any of that research is going to affect the standard? Well, it certainly isn't going to make it in October, and the next chance to do so is 3 years from now.
But we do have reliable guidance on how to secure our virtual and cloud infrastructures. And this being scoped the way it is actually secures our entire infrastructure, because no, wait. All they care about is magstripe data. Wait, why are we using magstripes? That goes back to our 50s technology idea. So there's one of the issues, is we have something that isn't going to do a good job. This is an argument I got into over the Massachusetts 201 CMR 17. It's the law that was enacted after TJX came out. We had a breach disclosure law that required the state to push out a law or a set of guidelines which had some sort of penalty if you didn't follow them, although there's no enforcement. Does that sound familiar? For how to protect your systems. And it got watered down and watered down and watered down. And I stood up at a hearing and said, this is garbage. What you should do is just jack the fines through the roof and let risk take its place, because anybody can talk their way around any of these, encryption, it's a horrible rule. And somebody got up after me and said that if you make a good faith effort at this, And I threw up my mouth a little bit, because if the businesses made a good faith effort in security, we wouldn't be here. But on the flip side, having worked in small and mid-sized businesses all my life, there's a series of problems. If I don't make payroll on Friday, then it's all over. And in security, we are notorious for losing sight of that. If we don't make payroll, if we don't do X, if we're publicly traded, so there really is this heavy financial constraint. And if PCI frees up budget, and at first that seemed like a really good idea, and I think we've now crossed the line with some of the people where they're really being held back. And there's some other things. When we're talking, you brought up the quality of people. Those of you that have dealt with external scans or QSAs who maybe weren't skilled or ethical, or either one. You know what I'm talking about.
Let me ask a question really quick. This is probably as honest a group of people in a room, I think, as we'll probably get. Just guessing. How many of you are brave enough or possibly willing to raise your hand and say you have benefited from PCI? There's got to be a few. Oh, yeah. There are. Look at that. There are, in fact, a fair number of folks in this room that would say we've benefited. Is it budget? Is it better security? Is it better living through checkboxes? Jobs, security, jobs, rock and roll, right? So honest people.
Let's look at the other side of it. How many people have had projects turned down because they're not PCI related, or because, and really think it's because they were not PCI related, not because your manager was just giving you a silly excuse?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a really important point. So far we've been talking about, the tonality or the design, but I mean, from my purview, in my last job, I did this massive market survey, and we basically counted 70 different security product markets with their own compound annual growth rates, right? 70. And that's way too many, right? It's an abject fail that we needed 70 to begin with. But if you look at which ones are required by PCI, there's 9 of them. So what happened was when the economy took a nosedive, you saw 9 winners and a whole lot of losers. And a lot of my clients at the time, now a lot of my new clients, they're basically saying, look, I go to my boss, I want to do a DLP project or a network forensics project or this or that, and their boss says, will I be fined if I don't do it? If the answer is no, then you don't get the budget. So it's not that there's no spending beyond those 9, but most of those 9, as I said before, are old, busted stuff near retirement. And a lot of the new, more modern projects for a new, more modern adversary, or for evolutions in virtualization or cloud, or whatever you got to do differently as your business has changed, if you won't be fined, you basically don't get a budget. So, I mean, it scares me, because what that does is it financially rewards laggard technologies, and it financially disincents innovative folks here trying to do startups, trying to do bootstraps, VC-based, whatever. And if there's no buyer for this innovative stuff, or if it's only that small secondary double hump, it's not that there's no market. It's that if you're on that list of 9, you're eating at the buffet table in the banquet hall. And if you're not in that 9, then you're begging for scraps in the streets. So I'm concerned about the long-term impact of too much money being spent on really old stuff at the cost of us focusing on what we used to try to do, even if we did a bad job, try to figure out the biggest risks in our environment and mitigate them with to the best of our ability. That's not the conversation anymore. It's we fear the auditor more than the attacker.
I've got another quick question, just kind of along the same lines, right? So, like, how many of you folks generally agree? I'm like the question-asking guy on the panel, right? But,
hey, we don't have any answers up here, so we might as well ask questions.
Yeah, I'm throwing it out, right? I mean, again, but I mean, generally speaking, wouldn't most of you agree that exploitable vulnerabilities, aside from physical types of vulnerabilities, are typically code-related? Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, it's the code. So how the hell do you get to a web application firewall and a really thorough code review being equivalent?
Thorough code review?
Well,
it's not required to be thorough.
Right on. But I mean, that's what I'm saying. Enter PCI. If I'm an uneducated, non-security background auditor coming through with the checkbox, I can take either one. Check you off.
Great. I was going to try to avoid jumping in a lot of this myself and moderate, but the code review. So here's one of the things about PCI that drives me nuts, and that's it. It's that code review versus WAF. And it's not what it says. It doesn't say you can't have both, but the way it's framed, and it's largely just misinterpretation, and that's part of what we've been trying to do in the past year, is get people to think about it, get people educated. But people have now decided, because they only need one, they only have to budget one, and the people that work in web app security hopefully would agree with me that if you want to secure your web apps, you're going to make your code as clean as possible, and you'll probably put a WAF in front of it just in case you miss something dumb. And then you find something. Yeah, you can pimp rugged later. Then you find something, and you go to that web app firewall. It's just like we do on the network side. When you go to your IDS, you go to your web app firewall, and you say, hey, I got this problem, and until the code gets fixed, I got to make sure this doesn't get through. You put them together. They're complementary technology. PCI, intentionally or otherwise, sets them up as competing. And there are several other places where the things that just get back and forth. And
Yeah, I'm hoping we get to this with Alex, but
he was starting to open his mouth, so let Alex say something, and then we have a gentleman.
Yeah, this nice gentleman's been standing there. Yeah, he's got something important to say.
Go ahead.
Good morning. I think that when we talk about PCI, we need to talk at two levels. One is what we're forced to do at the bank or merchant or service provider level, but I think you're missing a larger point, which is the PCI council level. I agree with the gentleman who said that the fundamental driver for PCI is that the credit card companies want to transfer risk and liability down a level or two. And at the same time, they're trying to say that they are autonomous, and therefore they're making an independent standard like ISO or whatever. But at the same time, they have a symbiotic relationship with their business partners, which are the banks and the merchants. And how many times have we seen a vulnerability like with TJ or whatever, or Hannaford, which results in discussion about a new control? They put out a draft comment or some draft guidance, and all of a sudden, when it becomes real, it gets watered down because there's been negative feedback. Oh my God, it's going to be too expensive, or it's going to be too complex.
So so when you look at PCI, when you try and look at everything, at the risk of making the complex simple, we really only have three issues, and I'm kind of getting into slides and stuff later, but that's all right. Right? The first issue is it the right thing for the card companies to do? Well, like it or not, unless you go to your congressman, and they're going to be able to buy the votes better than you can, so you're screwed anyway. But we don't have any control over that. We won't have any control over that. The second is, I'll call it a microcosmic view, right? If you think the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics, can PCI, can the DSS, can the various standard documents do exactly what they say they think they can do? In a sense, each document they create is a model, and it says we think that some outcome will arrive if this happens, right? And then the third problem is on a kind of a macrocosmic view, right? Are we creating things that will fundamentally change the future in ways that we don't know, okay? And that's because what you're looking at is complex systems. And in fact, the answer to your code review versus web application firewall is it doesn't frickin' matter. It doesn't frickin' matter because if you take and isolate any one control out of a control systems that you use to manage a network or group of systems or whatever you're doing, or creating a product or what have you, you're creating a Maginot line, right? In the Verizon data breach report, you'll see that data was encrypted 90% of the time in failures, right? So when there was a breach, hey, they were really compliant with these couple of things. Right? So you cannot, and so what we do is if we focus on one or two things and we just try and say, or have these wonderful, almost masturbatory sessions where we get up and we get all angry and crazy, what's the outcome? Anyway, did you have this is not to be snarky, but was there a question coming? I have a compensating control.
But first, I want to compliment you on being polite, because I wouldn't have said a symbiotic relationship. I think incestuous is a better choice of words.
I've been at a QSA re-up and had the tap on the shoulder when I use terms like that, so I try not to.
But wait, that does point out one thing. The great thing about the council is the transparency.